So, first of all, thanks very much for joining. And I just want a thumbs up on your screens, please. A, can you hear me? Good, thank you. And B, are you looking at a white rectangle with nothing else but corn on one corner, big green week on the other, and it says housing Thursday, today's date? Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to give a very brief explanation of why climate and housing are interrelated. We're going to look at the context in West Northamptonshire as a council district, and then I'm going to talk about the building resilience project that Corn initiated. We've got these headings: air, water, food and shelter as the basics of life, and we're running projects either ourselves or helping or watching other people run projects on them. So Corn is running an air monitoring project, because unless we know what we're breathing, we can't campaign for better health. We need to establish some benchmarks for that. So we've got pollution monitors located in West Northamptonshire, and we're working with others to get more monitors over the coming 2 or 3 years so that we can gather data on air quality and produce evidence-based decisions at planning meetings. We can say, well, if we're going to build there, we're going to make the air worse, and we can say what it's like now and how it has deteriorated over the 2 years that we've been monitoring it, or the opposite. We don't actually have anybody working on water, but that's very much our plans. In terms of food, we've got an awful lot going on food, and then more fundamentally, we've produced a book that's on how to regenerate your local area. And although we've got shelter in there, I've subverted it. We're going to call it housing. So what is the housing issue, and where does it relate to climate? 20% of all UK greenhouse gas emissions come from burning stuff at home. And that's nearly as much as the emissions coming from private car use, and just slightly more than coming from our power stations. So those top 3 sources of greenhouse gas emissions really trump virtually everything else that we've got. So if we can control emissions, we could do it either by changing our heating systems or reducing our heating demand. And that, in the simple way that people present the case, gets translated into install heat pumps and insulate, just those 2 things. So the houses we've got around us are not all identical. We've got a rich heritage of housing across West Northamptonshire, and clearly some cannot be insulated without extraordinary expense or disfigurement, and some just are inappropriate for heat pumps. So let's look across at the housing in West Northamptonshire. We've looked at the energy performance certificates. In the last census, there were slightly less than 140,000 total households, and the energy performance certificates that we've looked at would suggest that they are C, D, E rated, which means that they are not as efficient as the A's and the B's. And 60% fall in that category, which means that we've got 84,000 households with poor energy efficiency. It's a task to have to improve those. It's not going to happen overnight. We've got to change the heating systems, and we've got to reduce heating demand in those households. So across West Northamptonshire, we've got 176 parishes. The project that we've got is aimed to assess the scale of need for the energy efficiency upgrades. We're going to grade homes by the type of improvement opportunity. We're going to estimate the funding requirements. We're going to see where there are shortages. There aren't 80,000 heat pumps available instantly. I mean, that's just unrealistic. And there probably aren't the trades around to install any improvement. And then once we've done the work, we'll report the findings, and we'll start to lobby central government, local government, anyone who will listen. So what we're doing with the Resilience Project, it's the same as many streets and towns and communities are doing elsewhere in the country. It's bigger than most. Our aspirations are bigger than most, just because we're looking at the whole of the West Northamptonshire district. And that's just an inheritance of our climate action brief. We'll be collaborating with communities across the district boundaries, Rugby, Warwick, wherever we can find them. And we're not doing anything that's not being done elsewhere, but we are adding some relevant initiatives, which we can talk about. So how are we going to do 176 parishes? Well, we aren't. What we're looking for is community representatives to take responsibility for helping their own community to identify the opportunities for improvement in their immediate neighbourhood. So these are community-run assessments, and we've assembled a kit that will make that assessment a fairly straightforward process. It is time-consuming. It will require every homeowner who wants to take part to be fully compliant, able to help. And Corn will coordinate the community assessors, will run workshops, and will support their everyday we'll support them. So what does an individual household energy assessment involve? Well, we're looking at the building itself, we're looking at its heating system, and the preference of the people who want to live in the house. So in terms of the building, when it was built, it gives you an indication of how it was built. We have to accept that almost all our homes are handmade. Only the mobile home sites that we've got come off a production line. Everything else was built by people by hand. When they were built will indicate the sort of attention to energy saving detail that went into the construction. Our vernacular buildings, our traditional buildings, were really environmentally conscious. They were built with materials that came out of the ground, that allowed moisture to come in, allowed homes to dry out, and modern production methods tended to forget a lot of the basic construction skills that went into our traditional stone and our original workers' cottages that date from 2 centuries ago. So as we go through the decades of the 20th century, we had homes built for heroes, for people coming back from the First World War. They were very often generously built, and you will see some early social housing in our towns and villages that reflect that. As we go through the immediate post-Second World War, there was a major need for homes, and they weren't necessarily built to a very successful standard. They were thrown up as a result of a need to get homes built, and there was a very big constraint on the building materials. That persisted through to the 1950s, when minimum space standards were imposed, how big our houses needed to be if they were going to be built at all. And that standard, rather than becoming the minimum that you would be allowed to build, became the design guide for the builder. And the commercial house builders, for decades onwards, when they were building the new estates or the infill, more than sort of 3 or 4 homes, they were very rarely built to an extraordinarily high standard. They were generally built to maximize the profit for the house builder. And if we look at the original construction, we also need to take into account any extensions, because those would have been built to satisfy the building regulations that were then in force. So in terms of collecting an individual household, we need its data construction, something that describes how it was built, because, for example, we see a lot of stone cladding, on homes built in the last 30 or so years. And quite often that's just superficial. It's just a layer on top of a breeze block or a lightweight concrete block. So we need to know, if we can, what the construction looks like, if there's a cavity and if it's been filled. And in terms of the amount of heatable space, we need to understand the volume of the rooms, the size and the shape of them. So there's some dimensional information that needs to come from the household. And quite often, if the house has changed hands within living memory, there will be more than the conveyance plans, there will be the estate agent's particulars. And that would be sufficiently indicative of the size and shape and the arrangement of the rooms in the house. So we look at the heating system. We need to understand the type of the heating system that's there currently. Is it a gas boiler? Is the gas in the village? If there's no gas, is it oil? Has someone put in a wood pellet burner? If there are controls to that system rather than just being on off, what are those controls? Some homes will have radiators separate from the first and the ground floor. There will be a valve that turns on and off that allows the hot water to either heat the upstairs or the downstairs. And that means that you can expect the heating demand to be less if, for example, we are working from home and we're all working downstairs. We don't need to warm the upstairs. If someone is living on their own and they're able to say, well, I'm going to be upstairs for the rest of the day, I'm going to be doing the ironing downstairs, that the heating can be zoned that way. And we need to look at the kind of cleverness of those systems. Some new systems will take on board the outside air temperature. And if it's freezing, and you say, I want my heating to be at X by 7 o'clock in the morning, it will say, okay, well, we need to warm up the house a little bit earlier. And this optimization of the heating system could work the other way around to say, well, if it's really warm outside, we only need to put a quick burst of the heating in at 5 to 7 to get it warmed up by 7 o'clock. Then if the householder has got supplementary heat inputs, a wood burner or solar thermal panels on the roof, or maybe a Calogas heater, that's also important information. And in order to compare one heated house with another, it's really useful to get the annual energy consumption of the gas if it's installed and the electricity, and those are normally on the utility statements, the annual statement. It doesn't need to be up to date, and we're not interested in the cost of it. It's purely the kilowatt hours of energy used over a 12-month cycle. And just being a bit nosy, I suppose, if there's any supplementary energy input, such as solar voltaic, that's just information that would be really useful to have. So that's the heating system for the household. This is slightly more vague, and we were talking to some people who were doing this, I think it was in Liverpool or Birmingham, but regardless, the time that they spent going round to look at the physical part of the house and look at the boilers, they spent more time understanding how the occupant lived in that house, talking to them to find out what issues they had. Well, we live on a really windy site, and we know that we've got to batten down the hatches if there's anything other than light breeze coming through. Or there may be an acknowledgement that they hadn't done much to the fabric of the house, and the sash windows leak, and wouldn't it be nice if we could get those fixed or at least sorted out? And it's also important, in order to do a kind of in-depth assessment of the energy used, to know how people live at home. We've had a couple of years of home working. Is that a pattern that the householder thinks will continue into the future? Are they essential workers and working to shifts? Are there two people working to different shifts, meaning that the heating is likely to be required all day and every day? And then last but not least, we need to look at the target indoor temperatures that the homeowner thinks they deserve in order to keep the house comfortable. And those would have been the temperatures we would assume that would have caused that amount of kilowatt hours of energy to be used up. So we're looking at changing the heating.
Can I just interrupt you for a moment, Harry? Just ask a question. Sorry, Lillian's asked a question in the chat about how would we estimate consumption of oil by kilowatt hours? So obviously for gas and electricity, it's on their bill. For a lot of village houses that are heated by oil, do we know how that would be done?
Extremely good question. And I hadn't thought of the answer until you asked it just now. But I would imagine that if you know the frequency that you're getting the oil poured in, you could say we need so many litres of oil per 12 months. We could then look at the pattern of that if you had over a number of years to see whether that last amount was not conditioned by what it cost you, but what you actually thought you needed in order to put it in. And then we can convert the calorific value of burning oil, but then we would need to know which kind of boiler you had. So I think we can reverse engineer from knowing the two factors, how much oil you've had to buy over a 12-month period and what kind of boiler it is and what we would assess its operational efficiency at. Does that, as an ad lib, does that satisfy you, Lillian? Nod or shake? Don't know. Okay, right. Well, it's
a very interesting question anyway. It's the value of having people here to think about things, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you, Harry.
No, it's one that I had crossed my mind because everywhere we go, most of the rural areas that we live in, we just don't have town gas. So to get back anyway, what do we get as a result of this individual household energy assessment? Well, we know we've got to change the heating system. Well, we know we've got to reduce the heating demand. So we need to have, from our individual home snapshot, an idea of the fabric and system upgrade opportunities at that dwelling. And we can then look at what the occupant opportunities might be for reducing their heating demand. So we're looking at fabric and system upgrade opportunities, and we're looking at occupant opportunities for reducing their heating demand. So the kinds of things that we can do as part of our kit is to look at eliminating drafts using a smoke pen, suggest that where a draft excluder could be nailed up, or an open fire chimney that might be blocked during when it wasn't being used, and even putting heavy drapes across windows and doors that might be a bit drafty. And the occupant opportunities are really dependent upon how much heat gets lost through the fabric, what the prefers. So the practical problem is that occupants, if there's more than one person in the household, they probably have different ideas. Certainly, I can imagine from not recent memory, but I know that when my children were at home and they were trying to do homework upstairs, they complained when it was really too cold for them to do their homework in their bedrooms. And I also know when we get round the dining table at Christmas, everyone complains how hot our house is. So apart from me. So we've got so many different occupant preferences, but what I find remarkable is that an occupant actually runs fairly happily at ±1 degree of 37 degrees centigrade. I just find it remarkable that there isn't a human in the world that doesn't operate at that level. I mean, we must be absolutely perfect as a machine, a food conversion machine. But if we take that one person living at 37 degrees C, If we are near a cold surface, we're losing body heat to it. If we're near a hot surface, we will heat up. So we've got very clever thermoregulations built into us that appreciate cold surfaces and hot surfaces. And it's important when we're looking at our energy demand, look into the future, that we begin to build up an appreciation of how our human physiology actually works. We know from the textbooks that a indoor heating regime that lies between 19 and 21 will keep most people happy. What's less known is that there is the equivalent relative humidity center ground, somewhere between 30% and 60% relative humidity. Now I'm just looking at the outdoor humidity where I live, and it's 87%. So if for any reason I opened our windows and we brought outside air in, quite quickly we would get well above 60% relative humidity. And the relevance of that is that damp air, we lose body heat more rapidly than in dry air. And we don't need high temperatures when we're asleep. And if we're doing the ironing, we don't need high temperatures. I mean, I'm not telling you stuff you don't know. So improving home energy efficiency involves more than just installing heat pumps and insulation. We need to understand the human factors. And clearly we've got to understand the financial cost of any change to improve the energy efficiency. So our community-run assessments, we'll be looking for volunteer groups who will collect the household information. They'll be using a questionnaire so that the questions that we draw answers to are the same across our region. We'll be using thermal cameras to identify the very obvious heat losses from a home. And we've got draft pens to detect drafts. So Corn will be supporting those volunteer groups. We'll be running workshops and we'll be collating all the data. So the project timing, well, we've kind of roughly started with the public meetings that we've been able to attend during September. But in October, we'll be actively looking for the volunteer groups in the parishes. Once we've got those parishes and there are people saying, yes, we want to help, during November, we'll be running workshops for the parishes and we'll be data collecting between December and February. And that, I think, is when, from a practical viewpoint, we need to do the data collection, because the thermal imaging cameras need a very significant difference between the inside and the outside temperatures, or else we don't get any sensible pictures from the camera. So we'll be producing a report in March, and on the 1st of April, we'll be publishing the findings. That's it. I finished. Thank you. Is that a bit abrupt, Jay?
That was fine. Thank you very much. Excellent. That was really interesting. Does anybody have any questions for Harry?
But apart from oil, Lillian, I do apologise. I ought to have got the answer to that. I will have the answer, and I'll do it very soon, because everybody in the country.
Well, I suppose the other one is LPG, isn't there? Because there are some people that use LPG for heating, I believe.
There is, yes. Yeah.
Patsy?
I've always got a question, haven't I?
It's always good. It's always a good question.
Well, this isn't a question, this is two comments. The first one is that Harry made a good point about the inhabitants of a house liking rooms at different temperatures. My late husband liked to be in a really cold room. When I met and married Richard, I discovered that you could actually tolerate being in a much warmer room. It is a case of, I think the word is habituation. If you gradually accustom yourself to a room being less warm, it is really quite surprising how much cooler you can run your heating just from being more accustomed to it not being quite so hot. So the other thing I was going to say, which occurred to me while you were talking, Harry, is it's a good idea to have a thermometer that you can actually discover the temperature in a room, because our front room where we sit as a rule in the evening is about twice the size of this room, but it is also always much cooler because our dining room is just off the kitchen and we have doors that we open through. So we'll go into the front room, go, oh, it's cold in here. We're learning not to put the heating on. We use a rug or a blanket. And the final point was, as well as not needing it as hot when you're ironing, hoovering, vacuuming generates a phenomenal amount of heat.
Yeah.
So,
at least once a month.
Quite often.
so those were all just points that came up in my mind from what you said, Harry. It's very useful.
And you've raised some things that I might have mentioned, but I've probably got a bit of time to talk about it. The way we adjust to heat is all part of our magical physiology, so that the blood vessels that we have near our skin just shut down in winter, and in summer they open up so they can transfer the body heat to the outside, and we can lose the heat. So I think your habituation is just a normal human capability of getting used to things. But getting used to things has its boundaries. And what I really fear, and this is, I mean, we did get into fuel poverty as a topic for Corn, and recognize that we weren't in any position to do anything about it. There were other agencies that were able to do stuff about it. But the reality is that if we are having to turn our temperatures down or even not use our heating, no amount of habituation will stop us suffering from the risk of hypothermia, particularly if we're older and we aren't active around the house. And I think that the things that I would be including it in our workshop for the local people is how to watch out for those people who, in the best of intention, are compromising their life opportunities. If we shut down the heating by turning off the radiators, as people have been advocating, then in an unoccupied room, for example, then the humidity within the house will find a cold spot and will get mold. And if that's not tracked, then that will produce something which is bad for our health. And we've got some thermometers with a relative humidity sensor in them, so that you can read immediately what the air temperature is and what the humidity is. And we can worry when the humidity, as it is now 87 outdoors, start to becoming 87 indoors, simply because we've had to open windows and we can't dry the rooms out because we've got no heat in there. And I think we're going to see across our less fortunate communities, genuine heart, it's cold and damp, everything just spirals downwards. I finished.
Thank you. Lillian, did you have a question? And I'll come to you after that, Rupert.
Well, firstly, I think that idea of the thermometer for the kit is really important. And given what you've just said, also when asking about the habituation of the property, understanding what rooms are heated, so understanding how they're managing their own heating system. But the other thing I was going to ask is, I know broadly the biggest consumer in a household is your heating system of energy, but I wondered whether it's possible also to provide the houses that take part in the survey with some other information about what is being consumed in your house and how much is being consumed. When we had our solar panels installed, we've got an output meter which shows what we're using, and I was absolutely horrified when the first time I took my kettle. And I personally had no idea about the relativities about electricity consumption amongst appliances, charging phones, that kind of stuff. So
I don't know if
Yeah,
that shows
similar.
up on screen, but that's a plug-in monitor, tiny little thing, as you can see, because my hand's quite big. And that will tell you the consumption. So I've got a dozen of these around the house, only because I'm nosy, able to find out. We've got a small television, we've got a big fridge, not a fridge freezer, just a fridge. And I'm quite surprised about the relative consumption of modern appliances versus the older appliances that we've got. And I don't see, as part of our kit, that we wouldn't be able to, if we didn't buy them ourselves, get the parish council perhaps to get a budget together to share something that someone could borrow for a week, just to explore the individual consumption of their various appliances. The idea that people can use slow cookers because they're low energy, I haven't yet looked at I've been given 2 slow cookers for the experiment. I've got a small one and a bigger one. If something is not using very much electricity for 8 hours in order to do slow cooking, that might be the same as a lot of electricity for a very short period of time in the microwave. I'm only guessing because I haven't got the facts, but I think the whole point about the next 4 or 5 months is that we're going to be able to gather and share across every community that's doing this a lot of facts, rather than the hearsay or the single focus information that we're getting. We ought to get a broad base of facts and start to see something quite useful emerging when we start to report at the end of the winter season, with the intention, I should say, of getting some proper funding organised. A retrofit for a fairly old house is not undertaken lightly. I mean, if it can be done as part of overall changes to the home, then that's one thing. But in the social housing upgrades that are being done in Northampton, they're spending £50,000, and that's when it's per household, and that's when it's been done a whole street at a time. It's being done at a wholesale rate, and they are using kind of national skilled tradespeople. If we try to do that as our own homeowner, to do an equivalent amount of replacing all of the windows with triple glazing, replacing all of the heating system with something more renewable energy based, and slapping on masses of external insulation, then the cost is going to be at least 75,000, if not 120,000. And those are the figures that we're hearing from other groups that are, they're looking at it, but they're not actually doing it. So they are looking at, if there was a whole street involved, maybe a 15-year program where they can get that kind of work done, group together, get it done at the same time, and do it in terms of priorities. So if it's poor glazing, then get it triple glazed. If the doors are a bit leaky, get those replaced. Joiner coming in, let him do 6 doors rather than just your door, to get a sense of economy.
Thank you. Rupert.
Yes. Just unmute myself properly. Interesting about the kettle and individual appliances, but that's much more difficult when we come to oil and gas. I mean, how do we work out how much the Arga is using, for example, and also the question of hot water? Are we going to talk to people about their bathing habits and so on, or is this going to be embarrassing? Some people, you know, like a huge shower, high pressure every day, and some people just do one once a week, and there's somewhere in between probably is what we should be aiming for. And I don't see at the moment with smart meters, they don't measure the gas often enough. You know, I think when ours is working, we only get a reading every half hour. So it doesn't really show us how much, if I turn something gas on, how much it's using over and above everything else. So that's going to be a bit difficult. And I've got a second question is, do you have a specification for the sort of person we're looking for in each village? We found somebody suitable the other day, I think, but is that the sort of person we're hunting for? So I'd be interested in your views on that.
Am I guessing who this person is?
Yeah, yes.
Well, you're out of luck, Rupert, because I can't remember.
Was it the person who signed up at Scissham? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
I don't know who it was because I haven't got the. Oh no, hang on. They wrote the name down on the.
Yeah, he's recently retired. Very practical. It was
Oh
a
yes,
caravan.
yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was really
Keen to do
interesting.
something.
That was really interesting because it does highlight the practical issues that we're going to be facing. They've got absolutely nothing to do with rehabilitating the West Northamptonshire housing stock. Here was a man, a retired person, and we won't mention his name or where he came from, who knew exactly what we were talking about, what we were on about, and we knew exactly what would need to be done. And when we mentioned that person's name to someone else in the village, it didn't work. We've got to deal with the tribalism of the rural areas where, and I've got it in my own community, so I can speak with all honesty. There's just such a mismatch between the kindest and most generous of people and the perception of others of the reasons for that person being as they are. And there's just politics of the worst variety in a community. So the answer to your question is yes, he would be the right person, but if people won't collaborate with him because they have because they have a prejudice and it is prejudgment, then it would be futile for him to be encouraged to carry on there. We need to find someone who, I don't know if vicars, I mean, when I was little, it was always a vicar who was the man who was the person who was generally accepted. I mean, it certainly wasn't the bank manager, but I mean,
we may need more than one person in villages, I think, Harry.
Yes.
Well, but they've got to work together. They've got to collaborate. Look, let me tell you about my vicar. He would milk our goat in order to give the milk, because we couldn't milk a goat. He would give the milk from our goat to the lactose intolerant child who would otherwise have not been able to have any milk. He organised the TB because we had TB in the village. I'm going back a long time, almost as far back as your childhood, Rupert. But we had TB in the village, and it was the vicar who organised the shed and the garden for the people to live in for 6 months, so they didn't contaminate the household. You know, there are good eggs in the Church of England, or they were in those days. Sorry, Jane.
That's fine. Lillian.
Can you answer my question about the oil and measuring?
No.
Measuring it. How do we set about that?
We've got to find out how to do it. And Lillian and yourself are both asking really good questions, and I don't have the answer. If I measured my gas consumption by going out and looking at the meter, I take a photograph of it. It is a smart meter, but it won't give me consumption. It just does not give it. The indoor display does not give me a blow-by-blow account of consumption. So I only know that we've used X amount since I turned the heating on very reluctantly this heating season by taking a snapshot of the meter before we start and recording it at daily intervals. And you're better off if you've got a smart meter that gives you half-hour readings, because then you can say, well, it's roughly attributable to my daughter spending 42 minutes in the shower. I'm speaking hypothetically, yeah. Rupert.
Quite probable.
Lillian, you had a question.
Just back to the oil thing. I think it'd be fairly easy for most people to tell you how many litres of oil they use in a year based on what they order from their suppliers. And if we could multiply that by some factor for every litre of oil burned, because people will have different types of boilers and may not understand how old their boiler is. And actually, you know, the rate at which the oil is consumed will be relative to the efficiency of the boiler.
Exactly.
But on the subject of volunteers, I was going to ask whether you've got links into all the parish councils, because they may be helpful in getting you volunteers. Now, fortunately, I sit on our parish council, and I will be volunteering. But I think they would be useful organisations to garner support through.
Yes, and thank you very much for saying your hands up. That was really good. Thank you. We did a presentation on various things green with NACA Monday week ago, and it was quite interesting the number of parishes who turned up. I've done energy related talks through NACA to parish representatives, and of the 176 parishes that we've got across West Northamptonshire, there's often a really poor representation. So I think it's probably nothing to do with the talks that are going on, but just realities of life, that a lot of the parish clerks, the parish councillors, are extraordinarily busy people and may not have the time to devote to a particular matter like this. And it's really outside the responsibilities of the parish council. It's more the
But the thing about the parish councils is they know their communities, so they will know somebody who's not on the parish council. They know who's, you know, they'll have local action groups like I do, or they'll know people, and they'll have ways of getting out a request for help through their Facebook pages, their websites, that kind of stuff.
And so just to jump in a little bit, we are in contact with a number of other sort of local groups, a bit like yours, in different villages. So I think that's another avenue as well. And I think the thing with parish councils, I think Harry's absolutely right in saying it's outside of their remit, but parish councillors, by their nature, tend to be people who want to progress things to help the community, aren't they? So I think it's a question of reaching individual parish councillors, of which we've got quite a few within Cornwall. There's several here today, as well as yourself, Lillian. It's sort of getting it to the individual parish councillors rather than going through the parish clerk, because it isn't going to be formal council business. Yeah, I think it's the clerks sometimes that are quite busy and don't always pick things up.
Oriane's asked a question: will we be looking at urban areas and towns? Oriane, the answer is yes.
Very good question. Sorry, I missed that, Oriane.
As far as Towcester is concerned, because I know Oriane lives in Towcester, we'll be looking. Towcester is really interesting, and the history of Towcester is extremely interesting, because it changed from being a fairly quiet market town. When we came to live here in the mid-80s, the builders that we got in to help our renovation works, we bought a derelict house, were moonlighting from building great chunks of Towcester. So there was some post-war development in Towcester, but the majority of now part of the Towcester community went up in the early 1980s, and they're still building now. So they're relatively recent. And if you live in a house and you would be interested in taking part, Oriane, then that would be great. We've got Rachel, who's one of our members, who's quite keen. She's got one of the air quality monitors, and I know the year that her estate was built, because it was the chap who helped us who built her house. So yes, the answer is, and certainly the people who live in streets in Northampton, we are chatting to the Transition Town group. If they can get themselves together, then that would be great. What we aren't able to do is to help an individual homeowner. We just don't have enough bodies. It has to be through the agency of someone local who's got an interest in getting their own home and their neighbours' homes sorted out.
And I think the other thing I'd add to that is, obviously, ideally, we would have a good cross-section of homes and people to get a good overall picture of what the housing or the need is for housing improvements across the area.
I think, I mean, I've got a couple of minutes to wrap up. The biggest thing that we face as someone interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions is the complete surreal lack of knowledge by senior politicians, the ability of a government to offer grants that encourage, for example, an entirely new solar voltaic industry to start up based on a feed-in tariff, and then cut the feed-in tariff, and lo and behold, the industry evaporates. So we've had years of people saying, yep, I'm going to get myself skilled up, and then all of a sudden the rug's pulled out of that marketplace. Or a Green New Deal that gets a lot of attention on the press, that limits the amount of funding that is actually available. And when you get around to wanting to apply for it, you're too late. The kind of stop-start nature of government support for low energy initiatives is something that is quite deplorable. And I'm really heartened by Dame Andrea Leadsom's latest letter to me, in which she says, and this is great because it's something which one of our people that we met at a recent meeting, who is in the Cabinet Office, wrote. He said, the cost of improving the housing stock in this country is an investment that will save the nation money.
Yeah.
And that's what Dame Andrea kindly wrote to her constituents. And it's a no-brainer. If you're having to subsidise, as we currently are, the ability for people to afford warmth in winter, then for goodness sake, subsidise the cost of changing our homes from being rubbish to being good.
And this is exactly the point that Alexina made in her statement to the council tonight, actually. It's saying it's all very well then presenting their cost of living package in terms of helping people with extra vouchers towards free school meals and things like that. What you actually want to be doing is putting people in a position where they're not pushed to the edge, where they need free school meals vouchers, to help them with those long-term changes that will reduce their cost of living.
But we don't want to get into politics.
No,
but what we can do is get the facts together and say, of 84,000 homes, the cost of doing it is so many billions. Someone has got to find that. It's not down to Corn to do it. It's not down to any individual to do it, but the insurance companies that will insure those homes, the mortgage companies that will give them a valuation, are all in a position to find sources of funding that can be ploughed into it. It's unrealistic to look at the life expectancy and the occupation expectancy of an individual homeowner. That house has got an intrinsic value which will go on for 50, 60, 100 years. And moving it from nowhere to somewhere is in the interests of the wider community and the people who will be mortgaging it downstream. It is not up to Jane or Harry or Rupert to worry about something. We've got to live for now, but someone has got the mortgage on the homes that are out there, and it's their valuation that is in jeopardy if people can't afford to live in them. Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions from anybody before we close? We are just a little bit before 9 o'clock. Welcome, Brid. It's good to see you. I'm very sorry, but you're going to be joining just before we end the meeting, but there will be a recording available at a later date, and we'll share that with everybody.
Thank you. Sorry, I missed the beginning of it. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Okay, if no one has any further questions, I'll thank Harry for a really interesting presentation. As he mentioned, we are continuing with the Building Resilience programme, and we'll be doing some workshops in a month or so's time, and obviously dates of those will be publicised, so look forward perhaps to seeing some of you there. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks very much, everybody,
Thank you.
particularly you, Lynn,
Thank you.
for a
Goodbye.
good question.
Yes, Lady, we will share copies of the slides. Well, what we'll do is we'll upload them somewhere and send a link, because I don't want to crash people's mailboxes with big presentations. But yeah, thank you.